I welcome Mr. Russ Martin of the Global Product Stewardship Council. Thank you for coming along to help us in our inquiry. The committee has received your submission as submission 3. Do you wish to make any amendments or alterations to your submission?
No amendments.
Do you wish to make a brief opening statement before we go to questions?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Martin.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to appear here on behalf of the Global Product Stewardship Council. As you've asked us to identify ourselves, I'm Russ Martin, President of the Council. The Council is an independent, not-for-profit organization dedicated to understanding and advancing the principles of product stewardship. These principles, as we see them, have been provided in our submission to the committee. Within our first year of establishment, the Council has held the International Product Stewardship Summit in Sydney and grown membership to span 6 countries and include businesses, other nonprofits, including producer responsibility organizations, and governments at all 3 levels. We are governed by a board comprising product stewardship experts from the public, private, and nonprofit sectors in Europe, Canada, the U.S., and Australia. Details are available on our website. We have detailed our Australian membership in our submission. Our overseas members include nonprofit organizations such as the Product Stewardship Institute in the U.S. and Waste Mins in New Zealand. Our Canadian members include independent recyclers and industry-led producer responsibility organizations such as Encore Pacific Canada and Stewardship Ontario. We also have members that are new to product stewardship and with different interests than we typically see. The best example of this is Petronas, the energy company wholly owned by the Malaysian government and operating in at least 42 countries. We do not advocate one approach over another. Rather, we help stakeholders to understand the objectives, strengths, and weaknesses of various schemes based on independent, peer-reviewed analysis and sharing information on emerging initiatives through our network of product stewardship practitioners. We aim to facilitate the development of effective product stewardship schemes internationally. We support shifting physical and financial responsibility from local waste and recycling programs to the producers of products in ways that are transparent and accountable, while giving producers the flexibility to deliver optimal results and minimize their costs. We prefer outcomes-based rather than prescriptive approaches. The Council has actively participated in the development of this legislation, including the government's Product Stewardship Framework Legislation Stakeholder Reference Group. The Council supports Australia's development of Product Stewardship Framework legislation and supports the majority of the bill's provisions. In particular, we support the bill's intention to underpin voluntary and co-regulatory approaches to product stewardship. Our experience, as reinforced by overseas participants in the International Product Stewardship Summit, is that Australia has had greater success with voluntary and co-regulatory programs than many overseas jurisdictions have had, and they deserve our continued support. The bill's objects and product stewardship criteria are largely consistent with the Council's product stewardship principles and actions. However, shifting financial responsibility to producers, which is instrumental to product stewardship and producer responsibility initiatives, is not specifically included as an object of the bill or otherwise addressed in the bill. This is the most glaring omission of the bill as introduced. The bill's provisions for mandatory product stewardship arrangements also appear to be overly broad as currently worded. The bill does not include in its criteria the cost and significance of resource recovery. The criteria for applying the legislation are quite broad and could apply to virtually every product sold in Australia. Most products are sold nationally and most would contain the potential for increased resource recovery. When considering the legislation, it is worth having a process established to prioritize products that encourages consistency and allows for stakeholder input. The Council would be pleased to assist in the development of such a process. The Council is supportive of the overall approach established by the Australian Government to prepare the product stewardship legislation, and we offer our continued support. I'm happy to address any questions you may have.
Thanks, Mr. Martin. Well, I think you were here for Mr. Angel's evidence.
Yes, I've been attending all day.
So you've raised an issue that he has raised, and that is some other way of prioritising, involving business and the community in the application of the bill. What about the New South Wales Government's committee that supports the process in New South Wales? Is that a way forward?
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. There is quite a good deal of support that we saw in particular during our International Product Stewardship Summit, and especially from state and local governments for prioritizing products based on items such as toxicity, hazard, cost to manage. And I would disagree with Mr. Angel's assessment, though, in that the New South Wales EPR priority statements were neither EPR nor prioritization. When you come up with 16 items that are of concern and none are prioritized, that doesn't seem like a prioritization to me. New South Wales also had a variety of criteria that were somewhat inconsistently applied. For instance, if you have, especially early on, addressing the potential to be recovered meant that cigarette butts were targeted as an item to be subject to EPR. However, because cigarette butts couldn't be recovered, they were kind of let off the hook. However, packaging, in which the industry has invested millions and billions of dollars in increasing recovery, they were specifically singled out for EPR precisely because there was the infrastructure to help recover them. I would disagree on the EPR expert panel in that a lot of the discussions were still essentially closed, and most of us actually found out the recommendations only after the reports had been published. I would encourage a more active stakeholder engagement, greater transparency and accountability along the way to open it up to a broader range of stakeholders and to have that be more transparent so that a more diverse range of views is heard.
Yeah, thanks. You say that there's greater success with voluntary programs. How about tires?
Tires isn't one of the models that I would hold up. We've specifically looked at mobile muster, drum muster, which you've heard about earlier, the newsprint industry, and oil. And those are all prime examples of voluntary approaches that have worked well, whereas a number of our overseas colleagues have had various experiences where they say voluntary programs don't work. And I think we've been happy to prove them wrong in a number of instances. That said, I think that's because of some of the circumstances which we have in Australia that might make it easier for us to do it as opposed to some other countries. Generally, a smaller number of players makes it easier to get agreement among those players. Australia won't be a major driver internationally of a lot of change because of our small market size. However, I think that there are certainly some good models where we've done it well. Industry has stepped up to the plate and delivered in a number of areas. They're working on making those programs better, and it is something that we can actually share with the rest of the world.
So are you fundamentally arguing for self-regulation as distinct from government regulation?
No, we think it makes sense to give voluntary and co-regulatory approaches a chance to work first before automatically going down a mandatory pathway. Mm-hmm. Some of the discussion that I've heard in testimony today and what we've seen in the submissions has applied the number of criteria across everything, whether it is voluntary, co-regulatory, or mandatory. And it would make sense to apply a different range of criteria or a different breadth depending on the issue. If you have industry that is actively engaged in trying to make a voluntary or co-regulatory approach work, they want to institute it, they want the regulatory underpinnings to help make it a sensible program and address free riders, I see no reason to raise multiple bureaucratic objectives to block them in doing that. They deserve our support in doing that. Similarly, you don't want to go out and mandate a range of programs where it's unjustified. I understand that there is a selection process, there's the RIS process before something would be mandated, but in some cases, industries are increasingly saying, we want that accountability. We want a level of regulation that helps us make this scheme work, because ultimately that makes it more cost effective in the long run. This is one of the things that we see as well with financial responsibility, which, as I said in my comments, wasn't specifically addressed in the bill. But industries are increasingly willing to take on greater financial responsibility for product stewardship schemes if they get the control and the flexibility to make the program work as they know that it can, and if it gives them a chance to reduce their costs as well. So while it might seem that they're taking on a greater financial responsibility up front, ultimately from a long-term perspective, industry is valuing that control and that ability to reduce their costs to make the program work as they see fit.
Is that a generalization or your point of view, or what evidence have you got to back that up?
Well, when we held our International Product Stewardship Summit in Sydney in November, we encapsulated a number of the discussions in an issues paper, which we flagged in our submission. We can also make it available to the committee. But in particular, you're seeing programs for packaging, paint, electronics, especially in Canada. We're also seeing them in North America. A range of European programs are covered under European Commission directives. However, where they can, they are trying to get that flexibility in order to control their costs. Where we see costs blowing out is in mandated programs where industry is not given that flexibility. So we're happy to take the question on notice and provide additional examples.
Yeah,